Welcome, everyone, and good morning. Thank you for joining ITIF for this event on confronting global anti-competitive market distortions. I'm Stephen Ezel. I'm a senior analyst here at the Foundation. I am joined today by Ted Alden from the Council of Foreign Relations and Shankar Singham from Babson University. So the run of the show for this morning is that I will introduce our panelists. I will go ahead and speak for about 15 minutes introducing a new report that ITIF is releasing this morning called Localization Barriers to Trade, Threat to the Global Innovation Economy, and then we'll have Ted and Shankar speak in turn. So Ted, as I mentioned, is the Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in U.S. economic competitiveness issues. In addition, Mr. Alden is the director of the CFR Renewing America publication series. The former Washington bureau chief for the Financial Times, he's focused on also immigration, visa policies, and broader U.S. trade and international economic policies. Ted holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of British Columbia and a master's degree in international relations from the University of California, Berkeley. Shankar is the incoming managing director of the Competitiveness and Enterprise Development Project at Babson Global, the commercial arm of Babson College. Shankar brings with him a wealth of experience in trade, competition, and regulatory systems. He is actually one of the most experienced and well-known international trade and competition lawyers in the entire world. He's the author of the leading textbook on the linkages between domestic regulatory environments, competition, and trade, called A General Theory of Trade and Competition, published in 2007, that is used in universities around the world. Shankar has his master's and undergraduate degrees in chemistry from the University of Oxford. So Shankar and Ted, we welcome you to be with us this morning. Thank you. So, what's the context for ITIF releasing this report on localization barriers to trade and having a conversation about how we can confront global anti-competitive market distortions? And I think the sad reality is that countries' use of trade barriers have actually increased substantially in recent years. So the WTO just reported that in 2012, the number of technical barriers to trade, or TBTs, reported to the WTO in the year 2012 reached an all-time high. Now, they also find that non-tariff measures, or these technical barriers to trade, are actually twice as trade restrictive as tariff barriers. So while the global economy has done a good job of bringing down tariff barriers, which averaged globally about 26% in the 1980s, down to less than 6% today, a lot of countries have surreptitiously replaced these high tariff barriers with new technical barriers to trade and localization barriers to trade. And by doing so, this really fundamentally contravenes the spirit and the intent, and in many cases, the actual law of the global trading system, which is really predicated on the notion that it's about private enterprises competing in global marketplaces to provide goods and services on a best value basis of cost, quality, and delivery. So we really need to push back on these types of measures. So in my presentation this morning, I'd like to focus then on four things. First, to try and contextualize the nature of the predominant economic development strategies that countries are using today. Second, to give some examples of countries' use of localization barriers to trade. Third, to talk about their impact, the global economy. And fourth, to address what we can do about it. So we at ITIF would argue that there's really two dominant economic development models being used by countries around the world today. And so the first one is really predicated on an export-led growth strategy that seeks to decrease imports and increase exports for a country, while at the same time moving the composition of the industries comprising these economies to higher value-added sectors. So they're trying to replace call centers or agricultural production with high value-added semiconductor or automobile factories. So as part of this export-led growth strategy, there's really three distinct sets of policies or tactics that countries are trying to use to achieve these goals. And we can think about how they impact foreign enterprises and how they impact domestic enterprises. So localization barriers to trade are policies that are designed to compel foreign enterprises to localize economic activity in a nation in order to compete in that country's markets. So these LBTs include policies like local data center requirements that make local production a condition of market access to a nation. They include local content requirements, saying to companies, if you want to sell in our markets, you have to produce products with a certain percentage of local content here. So those are targeted to foreign enterprises to get them to manufacture domestically. We can also think about a set of policies that Schenker and Ted will talk more about that are really focused on favoring domestic enterprises. These are countries' indigenous innovation policies. These are price preferences for local providers in public procurements. These are discriminatory regulatory and antitrust standards, like onerous certification requirements that make it harder for foreign enterprises to compete. They try to advantage domestic enterprises and help those domestic enterprises, both as they serve markets in the domestic economy and as they export to global markets. And then finally, we can think about a third set of policies that are really general mercantilist policies, like currency manipulation. Right? So currency manipulation is a blanket policy. It affects all industries in an economy. And its goal, of course, is to lower the value of the currency so that exports from a nation become more price competitive in global markets and imports become more expensive. Currency manipulation doesn't distinguish its effect between domestic or foreign enterprises as they operate in an economy. It just has this blanket goal of trying to increase exports while reducing imports into a country. Now, sadly, in all too many countries today, this is the dominant growth model. And what it really eschews is a model that we think is a better alternative. And that is raising productivity and innovation across the board in economies by putting in place effective policies around tax, trade, talent, science and technology, infrastructure, designed really to boost the productivity of all industries and all sectors in the economy. Countries that think about it in that way recognize that it's not so much the compositional mix of an economy that matters, but it is about raising the productivity of all sectors across an economy. And I'll talk more about that a bit later. What do we do here? Well, okay, thank you. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, localization barriers to trade are policies that seek to force foreign enterprises to produce locally what they would otherwise produce elsewhere and export to an economy. They include local content requirements, forced local production as a condition of market access, forced intellectual property or technology transfer as a condition of market access, or forced offsets. These are industrial compensation arrangements. For example, when Airbus or Boeing sells a jet aircraft to a country like Israel, these are requirements that the country stipulates that a certain percentage of the product be manufactured locally as a condition of the sale. So what are some examples of countries' use of LBTs? Perhaps the most common and prevalent LBT in the global economy are what are called local content requirements. These are requirements that a certain percentage of goods or services sold in a country be produced using local content or intellectual property. Countries' use of LCRs have increased dramatically in recent years. In fact, analysts at the Peterson Institute for International Economics find that today, LCRs affect 5% of the total global trade in the world. That amounts to an impact of $920 billion a year, and they cost the global economy $100 billion a year and affect 3.8 million jobs. specific examples of LBTs, LCRs, for example, include India's announcement in February 2012 of a preferential market access mandate, or PMA, for ICT products. What the PMA said at the time was that 40% of information and communications technologies products sold in India would have to be produced in the country by the year 2015, and so much as 100% of certain products by the year 2020 to meet public procurement markets in India must be manufactured there. India has set a goal that by the year 2020, 80% of all ICT products sold in India must be manufactured there. Brazil, according to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, is actually the #1 implementer of local content requirements in the world since the year 2008. It has imposed LCRs on sectors ranging from oil and gas, ICT, automobiles, to clean energy industries. Brazil's LCRs come in two forms. In the auto and wind energy industries, for example, 65% of automobiles content must be produced inside Brazil for automobile manufacturers to receive preferential tax credits or to be part of preferential loan programs. So in Brazil, they tie LCRs to preferential programs if you're manufacturing locally. In other cases, they actually stipulate that you have to have local content or you're going to be fined. So Petrobras, Brazil's largest oil and gas producer, was fined $17 million by the Brazilian government last year because they weren't sufficiently using local content in the oil and gas industry. Local content requirements are also found in the audio-visual sector, and they're also found in the ICT services sector. So Nigeria, for example, is now requiring that 50% of ICT and management consulting services provided in Nigeria must be provided by local producers. And Uruguay and Nigeria both require that 80% of the maintenance and servicing for oil and gas services equipment or production facilities must be provided by indigenous or local providers. But LCRs aren't the only type of LBTs we see in the world today. They have become increasingly prevalent as well in the ICT space with regard to countries requiring that firms establish local data centers as a condition of providing digital services to a country. So for example, Vietnam's Decree 72, which was just announced at the beginning of this month, states that foreign digital service providers must operate local data centers to provide digital services like web search or e-commerce within Vietnam. Indonesia has introduced a new draft local data center law, and this law will not only say that foreign enterprises must use domestic data centers in Indonesia, but it's going to go so far as to say that all internet service companies in Indonesia must only use domestic data center providers and cannot use foreign ones. So these types of policies really are localization barriers to digital trade, and they fundamentally preclude the ability of enterprises to provide cross-border digital services like cloud computing. And so they're a real threat to the ICT industry. Forced technology transfer and intellectual property transfer requirements as a condition of market access are very common, especially in China. China mandates technology transfers as part of joint ventures in its high-speed rail, steel, auto, and wind energy industries. One particular form of forced IP transfer that is coming into greater vogue around the world is countries increasing the number of compulsory licenses that they issue. So for example, last month, the Indian Patent Controller issued a compulsory license for Bayer's anti-cancer drug Nexivar on the grounds that the drug was not being adequately manufactured inside India. And as I mentioned, forced offsets are another form of localization barrier to trade. Historically, they've been found in the defense and the aerospace industries, but now their use is broadening beyond public procurement into private sector procurement activities. So for example, Argentina has introduced a new program called export equalization. And what Argentina is saying is that for every $1 of imports that a company brings into Argentina, it must be matched by $1 of exports by that company from Argentina. So for example, to meet this requirement, Porsche, the luxury car manufacturer, has had to start exporting wine from Argentina so that it can meet its dollar for dollar match. So the point of that is that countries' use of LBTs is growing dramatically. And so what's the impact they have on the global economy? Listen, there's no question that countries' use of these types of policies can deliver short-term gains for countries. They can increase local domestic production and industrial base. They can create jobs. They can help increase a country's exports and thereby improve the country's current account balance, their balance of trade. But while these measures can have near-term benefits for countries, they're not cost-free, and in fact, they do harm to a number of parties in the global economy, particularly the foreign enterprises affected by them, the nations on the receiving end of them, the broader global innovation economy, and even actually the countries themselves. So when you think about how foreign enterprises are affected by LBTs, what they do is they really force foreign enterprises to produce in locations where they otherwise might not if the location production decision was left to purely economic factors alone. This has the effect of raising the enterprise's production cost and subsequently reducing its ability to invest in R&D and innovation in the future. By raising the production cost, it also raises the cost of the end product or the intermediary product. And so this means that consumers in all countries have to pay more for these products than would otherwise be the case. The nations in which these foreign enterprises are domiciled also encounter a cost. So for the enterprise's home nation, LBTs can lead to facility closures, cutbacks, or diminished expansions. And this is going to cost jobs and growth and potentially increase unemployment in the home nations of these enterprises. But LBTs also hurt other third-party nations. So for example, when Israel requires, as a condition of buying jet aircraft from Boeing, that 40% of that aircraft must be manufactured inside Israel, then suppliers and parts makers in countries like Turkey and India are hurt by losing the ability to compete for that business. And when one country puts in place these types of policies, it incents all other countries to put in place these types of policies. And so it leads to a zero-sum, beg-or-thy-neighbor situation and a fracturing of global production systems that really endangers the global innovation economy. Because really, what LBTs are not about increasing the global stock of innovation in an economy. They're not about investing in R&D and science and technology to produce more innovation. They're really fundamentally about shifting the location of where production happens in the global economy from one nation to another. So they're not really contributing to an increased supply of global innovation. And they also have a particularly pernicious impact on innovation industries. Industries like ICT and biotechnology and aerospace. Innovation industries have three key characteristics. First, there's a need for constant innovation and investment in very risky and very expensive R&D. These industries are characterized by very high fixed cost of R&D and development, but lower marginal cost of incremental production. So it can cost $1.5 billion to develop a biotechnology or a new biologic drug, but once you have that development cost and you build a manufacturing plant, the marginal cost of producing one more drug is very low. And of course, these industries are very dependent on intellectual property. So when you have a situation like when India issues a compulsory license for a biotechnology, that does several things. First, it means that this firm, which would have been able to produce a single manufacturing plant to manufacture the biologic drug, must either meet the country's requirement by building a new manufacturing plant in another country to meet the condition of producing locally, which would really raise the production cost, and decrease its ability to capture the revenues it needs from one generation of innovation to feed back in to finance future generations of innovation. And by causing the firm to lose the rights to its IP and potentially increasing competition in the global marketplace, it essentially compromises the entire life cycle of innovation, which is about innovative companies being able to take the profits from one generation of innovation and reinvest it back into the future. So LBTs can really undermine the entire global innovation economy. But perhaps what's not often thought about enough is that LBTs can actually do significant damage to countries themselves. And they do that in several ways. First, they really do inflict economic inefficiencies broadly on countries. So if you look at Mexico in the 1980s, Mexico said, we want to build an indigenous computer manufacturing industry in our country. So they put in place very steep local content requirements of up to 80%. They put in place very high tariffs. And they just made it so that if you wanted to sell a computer in Mexico, you had to manufacture it there. Well, what that meant was that in the mid-1980s, the computers coming off Mexican assembly lines were 3 to 4 years behind international standards and cost 300% more than the global average. And what that meant was because all the other industries in Mexico's economy were forced to use this more expensive and this inferior ICTs, it caused productivity to languish across all of the other sectors of the Mexican economy. In other words, by trying to favor this one particular sector, it really hurt its broader economy. And this is very common to countries using LBTs. Another study found that in India, for every $1 of tariffs it's imposed on ICT products, its broader economy has suffered a $1.30 loss because all of its other industries must use these inferior technologies. There's also real reputational harm caused to countries when they resort to using trade distorting measures like localization barriers to trade. The attitude among foreign enterprises becomes, why would I invest in this country unless I'm absolutely forced to? And one piece of evidence you can see from that goes back to India. So I mentioned they introduced this PMA in February of 2012. Well, what we've seen is that in the year before India put this PMA in place in 2012, foreign FDI into India's ICT sector was $2 billion. In the following year, it fell to $130 million. So the attitude of companies has really been, we're not going to invest here, you're absolutely forcing us to do so. Much better for countries to play an attraction game than a compulsion game. But these policies are really a second best choice. In a lot of ways, they're an implicit admission that our enterprises can't compete in global markets without these types of policies. And so LBTs can cause real reputational harm for economies. I mentioned that they engender a slippery slope by causing other countries to put in place similar policies. So for example, India wants to increase its ICT exports 13-fold to $100 billion by the year 2020. But if India is having to develop its ICT marketplace by imposing these localization barriers to trade, then other countries are going to do so as well, and it's not going to be able to export the way it wants to in the global marketplaces. So in a lot of ways, these policies end up being self-defeating. But the biggest reason these policies aren't an idea is because they really distract countries from putting in place the right type of policies that they need to sustainably grow their economies. And the final section of our report really lays out this alternative strategy for countries in the form of what we call an economic growth pyramid. And what it says is countries really have to get the key framework conditions right, strong protections of IPR, because you can't have innovation without the protection of ideas, effective rule of law, competitive domestic markets. You got to get your tax, trade, and regulatory system right. You got to invest in key factor inputs like robust physical and digital infrastructure, investment in talent and skills and education. And then you need to put in place sophisticated innovation and productivity policies designed to incent corporations to invest in R&D, into innovation, put in place policies and programs to support your SME manufacturers, ICT transformation policies. So by putting in place good policies to increase the competitive capacity of economies. That's the pristine path to growth. Still, countries are putting in place these LBTs, so what can we do about it? I think we need to do several things. First, I think we need to have the WTO expand the definition of what constitutes localization barriers to trade beyond local content requirements. We need the WTO to create a new database akin to their ITIP, or Integrated Trade and Intelligence Portal, to track LBTs being used by countries in a more sophisticated way. We need to complete new high-standard free trade agreements like the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the US and Europe and the TPP, and have these agreements really be forceful about eschewing and prohibiting countries' use of localization barriers to trade. We need to empower enterprises to fight back. We should put in place a 40% tax credit for companies to recoup some of the cost that they incur when they bring trade cases before the WTO. We should petition Congress to pass an antitrust exemption that would allow US companies to collaborate to avoid situations where they encounter in global markets where countries like China will play one company off versus another and say, well, if you don't transfer your technology, then we'll go to your competitor. We should allow companies to collaborate in terms of holding hands with one another to say, look, we're not going to enter economies. We're going to have a capital strike if we're encountering these types of policies in the global economy. We should remove a general system of preference benefits for countries that continue to use these policies. The GSP is a program that the United States makes available to 127 countries that allows duty-free imports of products, 5,000 of them. $20 billion of imports entered the US in 2012 under the GSP program. But 18 countries that are on the US Trade Representative's Special 301 report for failing to protect US intellectual property are on this GSP list. If you're on the 301 report, if you're using LBTs, you shouldn't be able to participate in programs like this and sell in a preferential way into the US economy. And then the final two things we need to do are to really reform the understanding of global economic institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to push them away from the dominant export-led growth model that they really work with countries around the world to implement. If you think about how the World Bank works, it's a collection of country desks, and each country desk is evaluated whether or not it helps a country like Bolivia or Argentina grow its economy and export more into the global marketplace. They don't think about the fact that when they look at the impact of what each country does alone, it can lead to a zero-sum situation globally where you may help Argentina, but you hurt Brazil or India. So we really need to push the point of view that it is productivity and innovation-based economic growth that matters and is sustainable in the long run. And I think it's important to make clear to countries. Foreign enterprises want to invest in your nation. They understand that there is access to pools of highly skilled talent. They understand the importance of understanding local needs and preferences and manufacturing local to cater to the interest of consumers in a certain marketplace. So for countries, it's about an attraction game, about competing on good policies to attract investment, not having to resort to policies that force foreign enterprises to invest locally. So that's an outline of our paper. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to Ted and then Shanker for their comments.
Do you want to stop there or just do it from down here?
Your preference.
We might as well just do it here and then we can have a conversation with. That's great. Thanks very much, Steve. I'm delighted to be here and to be here with Shanker as well. As Stephen mentioned, I direct the Renewing America initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations, which is basically a fairly small effort by a big foreign policy think tank to say something which is obvious but too often overlooked, which is that the health of the U.S. economy matters enormously for the conduct of its foreign policy. If we don't have a strong economy, our ability to be an effective power in the world is greatly diminished. My boss, Richard Haas, published a book this spring called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. The core thesis of which is that we're at a particular moment in history here where there are few serious threats to our security externally. It's not to say there are none, but there are no certainly large ones on the scale of the Russian threat during the Cold War. And we have the space as a country to focus energy and resources on putting our own economic house in order. And that really should be the country's priority at this moment. ITIF has done a lot of great work in spelling out how we might go about doing this. I'm going to keep this short because I want you all to hear from Shankar on the paper he did for us as part of the Renewing America project. I've known Shankar for many years, going back to my days as a journalist with the FT, and I think he's one of the most creative thinkers I know on a big piece of this issue, which is how to create rules that allow companies to compete and fully unleash the many gains in terms of productivity and quality and efficiency and rising living standards that come with competition, what economists call enhancing consumer welfare. Stephen did a great overview of some of the issues, the problems that exist in many different countries around the world. I just want to make a few observations, sort of underscore how far we are from living in a world where such competition is the rule. I was having coffee last week with the chief procurement officer for one of the big electronics companies, and we were talking about rising labor costs in China, and I was asking, well, given that situation, are you looking at possibly moving parts of your operations, the ones that are heavily dependent on lower cost labor, to places that are cheaper than China? And he said no, they weren't thinking about that. One of the reasons was the whole supply chain is there, so there are logical reasons for them to stay. But he said the other one, and it surprised me, but I guess it shouldn't have. He said the government there just keeps increasing the subsidies to offset the increasing costs that we're being forced to pay. Lower land costs, additional tax breaks, export subsidies. The government, he said, is basically willing to do whatever it takes to keep those businesses where they are, regardless of the underlying economics, which Stephen laid out so well. Second observation, we are currently working on the newest installment in something we call the Renewing America Progress Report and Scorecard. This is designed to be just kind of short reports accompanied with an infographic scorecard to try to be accessible to a general audience, to students and others who don't necessarily have deep knowledge in these issues. And looking at some of the key drivers of U.S. economic competitiveness, some of the underlying conditions that would make the U.S. a more competitive economy. We did our first one on infrastructure, had a recent one come out on education, which got a very nice pickup in the New York Times. The new one that we are doing, should come out in the next month or so, looks at trade and investment. And there's some numbers in there that really underscore what Stephen was saying in his presentation. If we look last year, the U.S. ran a $741 million trade deficit in goods and a $206 million trade surplus in services. Now, many of our most competitive industries, think engineering, think architectural design, think the services part of telecommunications, are service industries. Look at the market situation they face in the world. Tariffs on goods, as Stephen mentioned, as a result of successive rounds of the GATT negotiations and bilateral free trade agreements, are basically pretty low. Under 10% in China, roughly 13% in India, 9% in Mexico, but 0 if you have a NAFTA preference. But if you try to translate the various regulatory barriers in services into tariff equivalents, so what would be the effective tariff cost of the various regulatory barriers that U.S. companies face in these markets? They're extraordinarily high. 44% in Mexico, 68% in India, almost 70% in China. So we've got a situation in which the most competitive U.S. industries and sectors are still facing by far the highest real trade barriers, even though they're coming in these different forms that Stephen talked about. This isn't news to U.S. trade negotiators. I spent about 15 years covering U.S. trade negotiations as a reporter, and U.S. trade officials have been trying for years to deal with these anti-competitive market distortions, which is the way Shankar describes it, but it turns out to be astonishingly difficult to do. I was rereading Clyde Prestowitz's book, Trading Places, that he wrote years ago about the U.S.-Japan trade competition and why the United States was losing so badly in the 80s. He's got this fascinating observation which is that the Japanese, he said, really have a completely different notion of what's meant by an open market. The U.S. idea of openness is the government sets a general framework of neutral, non-discriminatory rules, and then largely gets out of the way and lets the market dictate results. Claude wrote, this was another foreign concept to the Japanese bureaucrats. They saw their job as one of guiding market outcomes in ways that would be beneficial to Japanese national interest. So the result in the back and forth on trade that I watched over the years was the Japanese would actually do a lot of the things that the U.S. asked. They'd lower tariffs, they'd eliminate quotas, they'd often, on paper, get rid of various discriminatory regulations that the U.S. would complain about. But it would have absolutely no effect in the market at all. It wouldn't change U.S. sales in Japan one iota. It became kind of this game of whack-a-mole where you'd identify a barrier and you'd stamp it out, and another one would pop up. So it got to the absurd point by the early 1990s that the U.S. was demanding market share targets. Saying to the Japanese, look, just give us 25% of the market, please. And so the Japanese would come back and say, well, you guys are the free market country, and you want us to give you 25% of the market? So this was, and you see this same pattern continuing today with countries like China, with countries like India. It's just incredibly difficult to deal with these issues in a traditional trade negotiating format. So as Stephen mentioned, there are efforts underway in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. There's a chapter that's supposed to reduce preferences for state-owned enterprises. But it's very much a sort of traditional trade approach of trying to identify discriminatory measures that disproportionately hurt foreign companies, and somehow stamp those out. But the problem, as Schenker argues in his paper, and certainly Stephen laid out here, is really much more fundamental than that. It's the lack of competitive markets in these places, which incidentally hurt foreign companies a lot, also hurt those countries in various ways over the long term. Japan did not turn out to be the economic success that Clyde Prestowitz thought it was going to be when he wrote his book in the early 90s. So I think that leads nicely into Schenker's work, and I want to give him a chance to lay out the arguments he made in his paper. But what he's trying to give us is an alternative way for thinking about addressing these problems of anti-competitive market distortions. We have tried for something like 3 decades now to deal with these barriers through conventional trade negotiations and have very little to show for it. So it may be time to consider an alternative approach, and Schenker lays out one here, so I'm turning it over now.
Okay.
Thank you, and thank you, Stephen, for hosting this and for your presentation. What I'd like to do is put this in a little bit of a wider context. Obviously, local content regulations and localization barriers are part of the problem, but what we've seen over the years is that they're part of a much bigger problem. And Stephen started out his presentation by looking at different economic models that are competing around the world. What we've seen is a real, this competition is really coming to a head. What we have seen is a real competition between what you might call a state-led economic development model, and it isn't only China. You have 2 papers here. One is the Council on Foreign Relations paper that I did, and then also a China-specific white paper. But that is not to say that China is the only place where this sort of state-led economic development model is being pursued, although it is fair to say that certainly they are at the extreme end of that model, but many other countries are following suit. And in fact, it is not limited to developing countries. There is a sense, I think, sometimes that developing countries employ all these tools, and developed countries have embraced, fully embraced competition on the merits. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is 2 things. One is that as more and more countries, BRIC countries, Stephen talked about India, Brazil, China, Mexico, they're all doing it. as more of those countries embrace these kinds of tools, we're seeing a response, not a healthy response from the developed world. The healthy response would be to try to further advocate for competition on the merits, but instead what we see is a sort of a race to the bottom in terms of employing these kinds of distortions in our own market. So our hands are not clean by any means, and we will see some of that play out in our trade negotiations in TPP and TTIP. So that's one model, a state-led economic development model, and then you also have competing with it, and I would submit not succeeding in that competition, a sort of more traditional competition on the merits type model, where competition on the merits, competition on the business merits is the organizing economic policy of the country. In other words, as Ted mentioned, the government gets out of the way. I mean, the government does various things to protect your security and your property and guarantee your economic freedom, which requires it to do things. It's not a suggestion that the government needs to do nothing in those areas. But once it's done those things, then to allow the ordinary forces of competition to prevail in the market, thereby liberating comparative advantage so that costs go down, prices go down, output goes up. And what you do when you do that in economic terms is you convert deadweight losses in the economy into surpluses. And that is how you grow an economy in non-zero sum terms. So, it is a non-zero sum world. You can destroy wealth as well as create it. A competition on the merits model that leverages comparative advantage creates wealth, increases prosperity, and sort of lifts the poor out of poverty. A state-led economic development model, as Stephen eloquently demonstrated just now, does the reverse. It converts surpluses into deadweight losses. It contracts the economy, it drives up price, and it lowers output. So you've got these two models sort of competing against each other around the world. The problem is that if the competition on the merits model fails, if it fails to prevail, then people are not going to ask the counterfactual question. They're not going to say, well, what would have happened if we had competition on the merits? Where is the lost $10 trillion in the global economy? What does that actually mean in terms of unemployment rates around the world? And we'll be living in a world where very high unemployment rates, 10-15%, are the new normal, and very restricted output and higher prices is also the new normal. That's not a world that I think we want to be living in. So just in case you don't have a sense of urgency about these issues, one of the things we wanted to do in the paper was to show the threat case here, that there is a significant threat case. State-led economic development is channeled through what we have termed anti-competitive market distortions, ACMDs. That is how state-led economic development works. That's how it's carried out. And the threat case, we've heard a number of numbers in terms of the costs imposed on economies as a result of these types of things, the 60% equivalent tariff in certain countries, $1 trillion as a result of content regulation. Our evaluation of all of these is just in the US market alone, which is a relatively open, competitive market. We are losing 12 to 15% of the US economy every year. And when I say losing, I mean wealth destruction. I mean literally lost, not money being moved around. 12 to 15% of the US economy is lost every year as a result of anti-competitive market distortions, not in other countries, but in our own country, our own localization rules, our own programs and so forth. Now, in countries like China, India, Brazil, Mexico, that percentage is much higher. I mean, we're talking about 20, 30 upwards percentage of economy in those countries lost, which goes to, I think, Stephen's point about the damage that is inflicted by these things on the country itself. What are those losses? Those losses are inefficiencies in the economy that arise because what these anti-competitive distortions do is they, as Stephen said, they force people to do things that aren't economic. They force people to buy more product from a certain place because the law says you have to, or to behave in ways that you would not behave if you were actually operating in a competitive market. And when you do that, you are imposing inefficiencies in the global supply chain. So there's domestic effects, there's global supply chain effects, and then there are direct effects on the countries that are harmed, or producers in the countries that are harmed. So who benefits from this distortion? Well, a very, very small group of local producers who are actually directly benefited by the distortion benefit. Who loses? Consumers in the country, other producers in the country where the ordinary principles of comparative advantage have been thwarted so that other producers are not able to be as successful as they would be in a competitive market. Producers in the foreign markets that are adversely affected, consumers in the global economy and producers in the global economy that are adversely affected, because remember there is a take not only out of the domestic market, there is a take out of the global economy as well, and they're not the same. So you have all these people lined up who lose, and then you have a very, very small group of people who benefit. Unfortunately, the political economy is such that those are the people who tend to have the loudest voice in the political systems of the countries that are doing this. So that's the threat case. Now, what are these anti-competitive distortions beyond the local content regulations and these other localization barriers? Essentially, we've sort of characterized them into sort of four buckets. The first is things that exclude competition completely. So a local content requirement, a local barrier, a localization rule excludes competition completely. Then you have the second bucket, things that and these are perhaps the most pernicious ones, things that artificially increase the cost of certain competitors. So these may be things like standards. In the China paper, we talk a lot about Chinese standards that are imposed, which don't exclude you from competition. You can still, Apple with the iPhone can still compete in the China market. It's just very costly to do so because you have to take on board a China standard, which is essentially an international standard that has been Sinoized for the benefit of certain China producers like China Mobile and others. Other requirements, generally things that require you to do something, which very often look like they're coming from a very positive perspective. Countries will often impose certain requirements for supposedly health, safety, and other reasons. The reality, when you scratch under the surface, is that these are really being imposed for competition reasons, to protect a local producer or something like that. Then you have the issues that are being tackled in the TPP and the TTIP to some extent, which are state-owned enterprises and the role of state-owned enterprises in the economy. Those state-owned enterprises, the issue with state-owned enterprises is not that SOEs per se are bad. Unfortunately, sometimes we fall into the trap, and it is a trap, of negotiating on the basis that we think they're bad. The problem with the SOE is that the government privileges and benefits that it gets that other private firms do not get distorts the competitive playing field, enables the SOE to do things that a private firm simply could not do. And that damage is damage to the competitive market. And again, that damage is measured in these welfare losses that are bad for consumers and bad for competitive producers. And the final bucket is, again, one of the more difficult ones, I think, and you're seeing this now at the sort of outer edge of state-led economic development, which is the misapplication of competition policy. The abuse, I should say, of competition policy. Stephen mentioned compulsory licensing in India, which is really an abuse of competition policy. Many of these things are done for, quote, competitive reasons or competition reasons. And this is one that's particularly difficult to challenge because it looks like the country is doing what we have been asking them, we the US, Western Europe have been asking them to do all these decades, which is you need to have a competition agency, you need to implement competition law, and so they say, well, we're just doing what you told us to do. It so happens that the implementation of competition law means that either foreign firms are not allowed to acquire certain protected local firms, or that competition rules are used against foreign firms, but an exemption is given to state-owned enterprises, or whatever way that happens to work. The competition agency in those cases is not being used as what it's meant to be, which is a facilitator of the competitive market, so you can have competition on the merits, but rather as another regulator. So you have all these other regulators, and then you have the competition agency that comes along and is an accelerator of a managed market outcome, and is being used in no different way than any other sectoral regulator. So in the context of our paper on China, we focused on a number of these types of ACMDs. One is indigenous innovation policies and the sort of onshoring, the forced onshoring of intellectual property. The use in indigenous innovation of government procurement to steer market outcomes. So the government, obviously in many countries procures huge amounts of product, including in this one. You can steer market outcomes by having a preferential policy in your government procurement situation. The use of standards that we mentioned. And recent actions, particularly by China's competition agency, where they've essentially attacked particularly foreign firms for allegedly anti-competitive activities, and blocked mergers for similar anti-competitive activities. The issue with respect to the competition abuse in China and in other places, and again, I'm talking about China, but it's very easy to use China as a sort of poster child for all of these things, because all of these things do exist in China, but many other countries do very similar things, and in fact one might argue that India has far exceeded and excelled at some of these barriers beyond the China example. But some of the recent China competition practices are particularly disturbing, and one of them that I just want to throw out is the recent cases where they really looked at pricing, per se, and they basically said pricing is somehow bad, your pricing as a foreign company is bad, you need to lower your price. Which, looks like, the reason this is so difficult to deal with, it looks like a good thing. It looks like the Chinese competition agency is doing its job, which is to do things that use the power and the force of competition to drive down price. But actually what it's doing is it's artificially forcing the foreign firm to price at lower levels because of an access issue or some other public policy reason. And this is no different to what we used to do in the US in the 30s and 40s, or the Federal Trade Commission used to do in the 30s, 40s and 50s, which was to mistake the notion of a competitive price with a lower price. That a lower price was always the goal of competition, as opposed to what the true goal of competition is, which is the competitive price. And you can go back to Richard Cobden and the Corn Law Repeal, who talked very eloquently about, I'm not interested in lowering the price of bread. Obviously you wanted to get rid of the Corn Law tariff, so you'd have more competition in corn, that would lower the price of bread, obviously. But he said, I'm not interested in lowering the price of bread. I'm interested in finding a competitive price of bread, and if it's higher or lower, so be it. So the problem in the early sort of 30s and 40s in the US and in Europe in the 70s and 80s was the way competition agencies thought that their role was to just be vehicles to drive price down. That may not be their true role, because if the price is artificially low, how have you arrived at? What are you doing in order to get the price to be artificially low? You're artificially reducing cost. And when you're artificially reducing cost, you're imposing all these losses on the economy, and you're also disincentivizing innovation, and you're disincentivizing the key reason you get innovation, which is risk-taking in order to drive competition. What do you want? You want more market share. So how do you get more market share? You lower price. How do you lower price? You lower, if you're operating in a competitive environment, you lower your cost. You lower your cost by inventing something. Okay, that's how the process is supposed to work. But if you're artificially driving down price, and the costs are not coming down, what you're doing is you're taking away all the incentives for innovation. So that is why this is so difficult to deal with and so problematic. And many of these things are hidden under the guise of a sort of pro-competitive policy. We've made some suggestions in the paper about how we might deal with these problems. What we've proposed is, essentially a coalition of the willing group of countries that, first of all, believe in competition on the merits. And we need to be clear-sighted here and understand that not every country in the world believes in competition on the merits. We haven't gone past the end of history where everyone believes the same thing. And so what we need to do is gather a coalition of the willing group of countries who do believe in competition on the merits and agree amongst ourselves how you would craft a set of disciplines to limit anti-competitive market distortions, including the ones that Stephen has mentioned. It is critical in doing this that we understand that ordinary trade disciplines do not work in this area, as Ted alluded to. All you do, this is kind of like Olympic drug testing, all you do by imposing trade disciplines, the conventional trade disciplines, which means you take, we're concerned about SOE activity. Let's define what the SOE is, and let's apply disciplines to it. All that will happen is that the athlete will find another drug. All that will happen is that China will say, well, it's not an SOE because it's actually a private firm. Now, it doesn't matter that we're giving all these privileges and benefits to it, but it's now a private firm, so your disciplines don't apply to that particular case. That's what will happen. And in any event, we don't want to send a signal to our trading partners that we don't like SOEs because they're just bad. We want to send a signal that we want competitive markets. That's a pro-consumer signal. And the way you do that is ensuring that SOEs compete with private firms on a level playing field for competition. In doing all of this, I've come to the view that a metric to measure distortion is absolute. All roads lead to Rome, and Rome is the metric. And without a metric, it is very, very difficult to argue this, to promote this, to advocate for this, and certainly to agree a meaningful set of disciplines on this. So I think, in terms of policy focuses, trying to find a metric is very important. Now, it's not a totally whole cloth exercise because competition agencies around the world have already got a metric. I mean, they already work with anti-competitive practices in the private realm and to some extent in the public realm as well. And the metric is very simple. It's simple to say, less easy to work out. But the metric is essentially a measure of the welfare effects of this particular distortion. How much are you going to be destroying? How much wealth are you going to be destroying? How much are you going to be imposing deadweight losses in the economy as a result of this distortion? That is essentially your metric. Now, it may be a model where you actually impose a distortion and see effect, or it may be much more of a price-based type test. But metrics do exist. Another area, another tranche of this is to strengthen the role of domestic competition agencies in advocating against precisely these kinds of regulatory distortions. So when Buy America, for example, was being changed as a result of the stimulus, we've had Buy America for a long time, but when it was being changed as a result of the stimulus, such that a carve-out, a waiver for 25% product, if your product was going to go up by 25%, then you could get a waiver from Buy America. When that changed from 25% to 6%, and 6% for not the product, but the whole project, where was the Federal Trade Commission? Where were our domestic competition agencies to say, that's going to impose all kinds of losses across the economy. That's going to create monopolies all over the economy. This is a bad thing. So we need to strengthen the ability of domestic competition agencies. So when you see these local content requirements or these localization barriers or other anti-competitive distortions in markets, that there is some domestic body that is able to go to these other government agencies and say, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're not going to say this is how you should regulate, but we are going to tell you the cost of what you're about to do to consumers in this country. And you better have a pretty good reason to inflict that kind of cost on consumers in that country. And maybe there are examples where there are good reasons to do that. But let's make sure that legislators are equipped with the right raw material in order to evaluate that. And then, and Stephen alluded to this in his comment about giving tools to enterprises to fight back as a result of these things. And what we've proposed is, and this is the more controversial end of some of our proposals, is that you need carrots and sticks. Simply telling countries, simply going to China and making all these very nice economic arguments about welfare and about market distortion and they want to eliminate deadweight losses will have absolutely no effect on real policy and real behavior. You need to actually have some sticks as well as carrots. The carrots only become effective once the sticks are in play. And so we have there are many tools that already exist actually on the books in terms of Section 337 in the US that applies to anti-competitive practices in other countries. There are ways that we can extend some of those provisions and some of those protections to essentially what you're doing is, and let me just say what the signal is first and then talk about policy. The signal that you're trying to send is we want competition on the merits. If you in China have a producer that is competing in our market and basically being very effective in increasing market share as a result of efficiency, as a result of a better mousetrap, a better way of doing things, we welcome that competition. We welcome that competition because our price goes down, our consumers benefit, our economy is benefited, and that competition is creating surpluses in your economy and in ours. However, if you're doing the same thing and getting to the same price point by a distortion, by a local content rule, by whatever it happens to be, whatever anti-competitive distortion happens to be, we are going to apply a tariff that is going to be related to the effect of that distortion. That's why, again, a metric is so important. A metric that is understood, that is economically robust, and that is not capable of the kind of manipulation that we see in our anti-dumping and duty laws, quite frankly. So that and a distortion-related tariff that is tied to the level of distortion, so that you give an incentive to the country to lower its distortion, so that when the country changes the level of distortion, the tariff goes away. They can apply for that. Unlike again our AD/CVD laws, which tend to, once they're locked in, it's very difficult to remove an AD duty or a countervailing duty from the system. And you have to demonstrate, that affected businesses will have to demonstrate that there is a real anti-competitive distortion, that there is a real effect on competition as measured by the metric. They'll have to prove that the measure of distortion is what it is, and they'll have to prove that they have been harmed as a result, that there is also causation. None of those things are going to be easy to do. You are not going to have a case as we do with the anti-dumping laws, where between 1980 and 1993, 93% of all cases brought by petitioners lead to anti-dumping duties. That is not going to happen in this kind of metric, and there are going to be many cases where businesses are going to be complaining about things which aren't, frankly, anti-competitive market distortions. And so be it. We have a system that actually has to be economically robust and defensible. So those are some of the proposals that we have. And then I'd just like to make a general observation on regulatory reform. Regulatory reform is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult because once you lock in these anti-competitive distortions, you create a vested interest elite group in the country that benefit from these distortions. And they benefit in real terms extensively, and as a result they will fight very hard to prevent any changes, and that's what we see. That's why it's going to be incredibly difficult to roll back some of the kinds of distortions that you've heard about. And so in my new iteration at Babson Global, in our competitiveness and enterprise development project, one of the things we're doing is looking at the preconditions for entrepreneurship and creating enterprise cities, which are zones with regulatory autonomy in countries around the world, where you can start off, as a sort of greenfield site for regulatory systems. You can start off with a pro-competitive environment, and then you can resist the forces that pull in the opposite direction. And then finally, just a couple of observations on what Stephen mentioned. In terms of an antitrust exemption for companies, we think that it's better to have a distortion, a tariff based on the distortion in the other country, simply because the concern about an antitrust exemption is that it's how it will be used, and what companies will do in other markets and in our own market. Absolutely in agreement on the IMF and the World Bank. Unfortunately, many of the multilateral agencies have often supported exactly the wrong kind of policies for countries. And in fact, you've got some examples of the IMF supporting countries who refuse to adhere to the customs valuation agreement because it means a short one-time loss in revenue. Even though it doesn't really mean that, because in a non-zero-sum world, increased trade, even if you lower the tariff, increased trade will obviously lead to more revenue. And then just another example of that, a recent group looking at competitiveness in the IDB and OAS and various other bodies have cited to a local content rule in Colombia as an example of the country's competitiveness. So we have a lot of work to do with multilateral agencies and international financial institutions to sort of, and part of the problem, I think, as you said, Stephen, is the way they're set up. The horizontal groups within the World Bank, IMF, and so forth would have no problem with anything that any of us have said today, and will no doubt fully agree with it. But when you get down to the country level, you get a very different view. So I think US policymakers, in terms of their discussions with those agencies, need to bear that in mind and take that forward. So that's just a few sort of modest proposals about how we can deal with what I think is probably the single biggest threat to the global economic system now, and also a significant threat to US national security.
So I think that's absolutely right. Great. Well, Shankar and Tej, thank you very much, both of you, for those excellent comments. Why don't we open it up now to the audience for question, discussions, and Q&A. So think about any questions you might have, and while you're doing that, let me ask a question to get us started to the panel. One thing we'll hear is this country saying, well, you yourselves put in place these types of policies, so why aren't we justified in doing so ourselves? You mentioned the Buy American provisions in the United States. Quebec and Ontario have feed-in tariff provisions in the wind energy industries. How do we respond to countries saying to us?
I mean, you hear this all the time in trade negotiations, and it's a dilemma for the United States because there's sort of two schools of thought. One is the lead by example school, so that we should try to eliminate these things and thereby show the world the proper path. The difficulty of that is that when you're dealing in a global market where distortions are so prevalent, you expose yourselves in various ways. I mean, if you have a completely open, pro-competitive economy and many of your significant competitors are operating in economies that are state-led, not pro-competitive, it can do a lot of damage to your producer base. So it's a constant challenge. I think the right approach is to negotiate these things out in various ways. And I like Shankar's suggestion of a kind of coalition of the willing, so it's not one country, the United States, standing there on its own saying, we're throwing the gates open, that you're working in a broader collective, setting rules that are mutually beneficial. Obviously, first, they don't bring a lot of the countries that you care about, but that you get the mutual gains from that larger economic space. I think that that's an easier approach to sell, certainly to Congress and public in the United States, and I think probably ultimately more beneficial to the United States as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we do hear that argument all the time, it's the number one argument, for example, in China-US discussions. The problem is, this is again why the metric is so important, because the problem is that we may both have buy local policies, but those policies may have very different actual market effects. In fact, even within our own, just within the US Buy America policy, the Buy America policy of the 30s and 40s had a very different effect than the Buy America policy of fiscal stimulus, because if you cut out the waivers and you increase the local content requirement from 50, 60% to 100%, you're going to have a massively different effect. So we need to be talking about the effects rather than the policy itself. That I think is the first thing. And the other thing that we need to get in front of is making the costs of these distortionary policies explicit to consumers, and making this much more about consumer welfare, about consumers, than about producers. As long as we are fighting with countries, basically saying it's our producers versus your producers, we are doomed to either not win or not get the most optimal outcome. A better approach is to focus on consumers, making these costs explicit can help, I think, do that. And there is a role there for domestic competition agencies to actually be active in that process, making those costs explicit, as opposed to what too many of them are doing, which is damaging the competitive process by the abuse of competition.
Questions or comments from the audience? Please identify yourself.
Sure thing. Brian Popper from Town. There's been a lot of activity in India specifically recently. Of course, the Prime Minister is here meeting with President Obama in the next few days. I work with a group of coalitions that have formed together called the Alliance for Fair Trade with India, motion pictures, recording industry, bio, all range of companies and interests who are really having trouble in India. I take everything that you say makes sense in terms of the things that we as a government or our government can do. What can private companies do? What more? We've been trying to raise these issues on policymakers' radar screens, make sure they know this is a real issue. I think there's been a lot of success there, but is there something else you think that the companies and associations and coalitions who are really having a hard time in India, what more can they do to try to force the issue or change these harmful tactics?
Well, let me give you an example of one of the things that I was talking about in terms of making costs explicit, which is something that companies can very much help with in terms of actual research and studies and so forth. In Mexico, where the airports, the international airport of Mexico City, is very much controlled by the incumbent Mexican airline. And how is it controlled? It's controlled through anti-competitive slot allocation. So the Mexican Competition Agency did a study, and they didn't do the study in isolation. It was competing firms that were losing out to people helped, on the effect of anti-competitive slot allocations in terms of distortion, in terms of welfare effects, and concluded that $3 billion a year was lost in Mexico because of the anti-competitive slot allocation, which translated to whatever it was, $1,000 per flying Mexican family or whatever. And this was headline news in the Mexican market. So I think, and the result of this was the issue just went from a hidden issue that was contained within a particular agency to a major national concern. And I think what the private sector can do is work, we have the ability to work in the country. We don't need to rely on, our work should not stop at the door of USTR. We need to be able to work in the country. And this is why economic robustness of the metric is important, because what you say has got to be accurate. It's got to be based on something that is robust. To actually make explicit the costs of particular policy to domestic Indian consumers, and make it clear, and and thereby separate everyone else from the very narrow interests that are being benefited by the distortionary policies in India. And so this is kind of like, when, what's good for General Motors, I apologize for somebody from General Motors in the room, what's good for General Motors is good for the US. That's the way that developing countries who are distorting their markets play this out. There's a domestic producer who's being benefited. What's good for that domestic producer is good for everyone in the country. So the role of the private sector, I think, is to break that dynamic and demonstrate that actually 90% of the national interest is in a pro-competitive system because prices will be lowered. Let's show you how. And let's use our PR to get that out to the public. I think that would be very effective.
I would add to try to empower the voices within India who see this issue in the same terms. So ITIF will be releasing a paper in December in collaboration with the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, called the Economic Council, to make exactly these points.
That's great.
Please, okay.
I'm Bob Epstein, now with the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, and I appreciate all these comments. It's a very complex subject, to say the least. And I think my own view is, based on my experience, is that there are two approaches. One is to persist with trade negotiations, persist in building the rules, persist in enforcing the rules, though I'm not sure giving a subsidy, financial incentive for companies to sue in the WTO would really work, because the disincentives to that really are the retribution that the suing company might experience in the market in question. But that's really a digression. So I don't agree with that trade negotiations is a sort of game of whack-a-mole that Christophe Change presented on shows. I think the best example is China. China made amazing steps forward when in 2001 it joined the WTO. It paid a very high price in terms of applying to its economy rules that most of the rules that many of us take for granted, or that have already implemented. Now, then there was a period of retrenchment, and the Chinese leadership seems to have, at least on one level, changed its policy in face of the realities. So one way is to persist in building the rules and enforcing them. The other way forward is maybe to expect that the countries that adopt these rules wholesale will find they don't work. And in the case of China, it seems this leadership has found that it's not working. They're not generating the real growth and the real jobs they need. So what have they done? They've made statements at the topmost level of the State Council, sometimes repudiated by lower levels, but nonetheless very important policy statements. What's the proof of the pudding? They have changed entirely their tune in the BIT negotiations, the US-China BIT negotiations, by taking two steps that I don't need to go into now, but that were the essence of the United States approach, and they have accepted them, at least verbally they have accepted them, in an incredible way. Now, whether they'll implement them or not is another matter. Secondly, they, on Friday, have done something that has been expected over the summer. That is to say, they suggest that they join the Trade and Services Agreement negotiations in Geneva. That is extraordinary. China and India and Brazil have absolutely refused, stonewalled that negotiation. Were China to be allowed to join now, for China to seek to join now is exceptionally interesting. Now, whether we should allow them to join is quite another matter. And I'm glad that the U.S. spokesman in Geneva express some concern and doubt whether now is the right time, whether we should get we should get critical mass in that negotiation before bringing in a factor as potentially disruptive as the Chinese. In any case, I think perhaps the way to failure or the need to succeed in the case of China may be driving serious change. Maybe that will be the case in India. Certainly their policies can't be seen as succeeding. So perhaps, as in the time of Nehru, attempt at autarky, the current regime will say, okay, this ain't working, and we need to globalize. So for a moment on the SOEs, the real advances being made there are being made only recently in the TPP. The United States tabled text, a text that was promoted hugely, drafted in a way by the Council to CSI and the Chamber of Commerce, and adopted by the White House with Mr. Froman's leadership, and it was tabled, I think now a year and a half ago, and gotten nowhere, absolutely nowhere, dead in the water. Luckily, in the last 2 rounds or so, we've gained some major allies. We brought over the Australians. It is said we brought over the Australians, and it looks like that has real life. And if so, it is it accepts, Shankar, as you probably know, that state-owned enterprises are a reality. It doesn't try to outlaw them. It simply provides rules of the road and a fair competitive playing field. Now, that is.
Question. Your question for the panel.
Okay, sorry. That's it.
Fair enough. Okay. I think
it was a
I mean, one of the main points and the reason ITIF wrote this paper on localization barriers to trade is to make the reason we are releasing this paper this morning, is to make the point that these types of policies aren't generating the outcomes that countries ultimately want, and it's replete with case studies of countries like Mexico. When Mexico abandoned its impermanization policy in the 1990s, it actually built a little Silicon Valley near Guadalajara by embracing global supply chains. So there are other better paths for countries to take, and I think that's the key point here. Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, Michael U.S. International Trade Commission. So very thoughtful comments, and I appreciate the balance that you're trying to strike here between the economic theory and educating the policymakers and people in power and some of the places that are using these things like the loss and the long-term adverse effects economically. It seems in a lot of literature we're seeing, even out of India, a lot of the Indian economists have repeatedly for the last 2 decades said that some of these policies are very bad for the economy, but they're not getting any traction for policy makers. Same in China and so forth. So I appreciate the idea about some of these sticks, but it seems like educating the consumer that option is a real long-term proposition. Meanwhile, these policies are getting implemented by the people in power. So my question for you is, what would be your suggestions for policymakers in this coalition of willing? How could they educate policymakers beyond the theoretical? Because they're looking at it from the latecomer standpoint. We're late to these innovation things that the Western world has done and the advantages that they've got from all these free trade agreements and these market policies. We're latecomers. We should have special treatment. How do you educate policymakers that they can still get there by not pursuing this policy? There's more and more literature out there and more emphasis by these countries that they require these special situations or special treatments in order to get to where they have a domestic electronic industry, a domestic auto industry, a domestic aerospace industry. Otherwise, they will force these things through these mechanisms that we know in theory are not long-term beneficial economically to the world or to their countries.
Well, just to come back to Bob's point, I think what we're suggesting here is not that we would abandon the existing trade negotiations and pursue this solely. The idea is that this, I think, is a supplemental way of moving things forward. And you're right to say that the environment in any country, but China in particular, China, the environment is very complex and it's not monolithic. And there is this tension between this reform-minded group and the and the more planning-oriented, if you will, group. And part of our challenge as policymakers is to try to tip that balance in careful and systematic ways in favour of the reform-minded group. The reform-minded group, for example, immediately after the WTO accession was definitely the driving seat. That changed in 2007, and the planning-oriented group is charged now. So we advocate continuing in the WTO and continuing in Doha and continuing in all these different fora, but also to add some real sticks, understanding that the rhetoric and the reality are often very different in China, in India, and that relates to your question, which is it's a political problem, it's a political issue, it's the way political systems are structured in these countries. That you could have all the proof in the world, and you could have every economist in India writing stories about how various Indian policies are bad, and it will have no effect because of the power that the vested interest groups that benefit from protection have over the government. And the only way to break that is to make explicit costs and do that. This is again where the private sector comes in, and to do that in explicit ways using local media, using PR campaigns and so forth to get the message out. So you start to weaken the whole, weaken the sort of iron bond between the vested interest protected entities and the government. So I think that is an extremely important aspect of this, that if that's not followed, you know, many of these countries do not have political systems that will allow, quotes, common sense to prevail.
And you know, Mike, to answer your question, I mean, I think we have to do a very good job at two things. Number one, showing any of these types of barriers for ourselves, but number two, showing these policymakers in countries around the world case studies of nations that have eschewed these types of policies or abandoned them and achieved the economic growth they want. Made the point to countries like Costa Rica, which completely liberalized its economy, removed LCRs, removed tariff barriers, and saw actually an explosion of manufacturing activity inside Costa Rica because now global multinational corporations saw this as a great environment to produce and manufacture and look at data and see real growth in the industry. You see the same thing in Mexico. Point to countries like Australia, which got rid of forced offsets entirely in defense and civil aviation, and point to countries and say, when Australia did that, they didn't lose their suppliers in defense and aviation industries. They actually grew. So we have to do an excellent job of showing the case studies and working with the policymakers at global institutions to make these same points so that all the voices are saying the same thing.
Can I just add, just for information, that the USITC has been asked by Congress in a unique bicameral request. We're doing 2 studies on these trade barriers in India right now. The first one will be out in a year. We're having a hearing next month. But it will be interesting to see where one study is kind of listing all the trade barriers and distortions and the LCRs and so forth. The other study is an attempt to model or quantify metrics, as you say, on the impact on U.S. firms and businesses as they face these. So that will be out about 14 months. But again, the Congress is very interested in this. But it remains to be seen as we try to educate and put these things in front of the policymakers. What the effect
I'll just say the 336 study that ITC did on China, which was the first study that had some welfare effects type analysis in it, is I think the way to go. And I think doing that type of work may not yield benefits immediately, but you're going down the path of making these things explicit and helping the countries to reform themselves. We have to work on lots of different.
Let's take one more question. Go ahead.
Joe Tasker, I'm a consultant to the IT industry. You guys recommend a lot of heavy lifts in terms of changing parts of the basic WTO documents and some things that haven't been done, and I'm not quite sure what the path is to get a lot of those things done. But one thing you didn't mention is the government procurement agreement, and I was wondering why. It's an agreement that basically limits the role of the Buy American Act in the United States to a pretty good degree, and if you don't think so, we can we can have a debate about that later, but it really has limited what is, what the Buy American Act in the U.S. Very important. I've had conversations with Indian companies who really want to bid on government contracts, and they can't because India is not part of the government procurement agreement. And they really want to, they really don't understand why they can't do that. So it has a real world effect out there in terms of moderating the effect of the localization provisions in our country and others. So is it on your radar? Is it a good thing, bad thing, failed thing?
I'll just say we have a box about that in our report explicitly. I mean, I think one of the points about Buy America is that it's weighed for other countries that are members of the government procurement agreement. So, India could sign on to the GPA as a full signatory,
Right.
and then it wouldn't be affected by those policies. So I think a goal of policymakers should be to globally expand countries' accession to the GPA. Now, all that said, and we actually did this in the report, the Buy America is not doing the United States any good, and we should kill the policy tomorrow. I do think we have to lead by the force of example and have moral suasion if we're to show countries that the path we're advocating.
We should go walk around the hills, the halls of Congress someday. Just listen to the answers that you get when you make that suggestion, even though it's not that big a deal.
I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, certainly the government procurement agreement is a very powerful agreement, and we would certainly advocate trying to get all countries to sign up to it. And that will definitely improve some of these anti-competitive distorts that come to government buying. I would point out, though, that some of the, when you look under the government procurement agreement, particularly the US's commitments at state and particularly, obviously, no commitments at municipal level, the way government procurement works in the US is very much sometimes to use federal dollars and drive them down to the states and municipalities who are actually the owners of the procurement program. And when you have that case, your coverage under the GPA is very limited, and it doesn't exist at the municipal level. And
At
there's
the
a big
municipal level,
and there's a big
sort of a
debate.
function of the way the constitutional system works here.
Right, but there is naturally other countries will say, well, okay, so you've signed up to the agreement and you mix one federal dollar with municipal state procurement and you're exempt from these obligations. We have a problem with that. So Canada actually, when the Buy America thing was coming out in 2009, contemplated actually bringing a case, because I recommended that they should have brought the case, because it would have demonstrated this issue.
And they only did it because we accepted them.
Yeah. Well, we then did a negotiation with them, which they lost. They got the short end of that negotiation. But
there are 23 states that do accept the
yeah, but
GPA
there's no municipal coverage at all. And in the case of a lot of procurement, there's done by the municipalities using federal dollars and using state dollars.
So we need to lead by example.
But I think but that's a sort of wrinkle on the answer. The answer is yes, it's absolutely very important, and we certainly would advocate part of the suite of agreements that we would advocate pushing on. I would also point out that under existing WTO rules, there are many provisions of the WTO that do cover this type of problem, and arguably not in enough detail, but they do cover this type of problem, and therefore fashioning an agreement on anti-competitive distortions is actually not doing something out of whole cloth. You've got the way Article 3 is interpreted by the WTO in terms of the recent Japan, Korea, and Chile cases where it's equality of competitive opportunity. You've got Article 17 on state trading enterprises where commercial interest tests can be applied in pro-competitive ways. You've got the basic telecoms agreement. You've got the reference paper on competition safeguards, which is basically a competition policy document. And you've got non-violation, nullification, and impairment provisions in the WTO that exist now that can be used in creative ways to attack some of these problems. So I don't think what we're proposing is a radically new agreement. What we're proposing is taking what exists already in the WTO and what will exist in the context of the International Services Agreement, building on that.
I think that's going to have to be the last word. Shanker and Ted, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you to all for coming, and a round of applause for our panelists.